let's talk about the scope today in NEC 4 ECC. Now, I've got an intention to rework some of my previous videos which have been done in Cantonese in English because some of you requested, and I'm more than happy to do so. In fact, in the coming videos, I'm going to rework some of my previous videos in Cantonese and redo that in English. I hope that will help a lot of you here. So the scope is one of the fundamental concepts which we need to understand. What is the scope? The scope is nothing more than a deck of documents specifying and describing the works. And it is a deck of documents which states any constraints on how the contractor provides the works. And that is the scope. For example, your drawings. Your drawings describes the work. Your drawing describes the work and therefore is part of the scope. Your specification, for example, general specification, particular specification, they specify the works and therefore is part of the scope. So it's any document which fits into this criteria, this definition here, we call that the scope. Where can we find it? Now, the contract says we can find it in whatever document which the contract data states it is in. So we understand a contract data is called contract data part 1 and contract data part 2. Then the next question will be, which part? The answer is both parts. So let me explain a little bit. Do you know the scope has got two parts? Or should I say two subcategories? The first subcategory, we call that the client scope. Or under the contract, the full phrase here is the scope provided by the client. The second subcategory here is what I call the contractor scope. Under the contract, the full sentence in there is the scope provided by the contractor for its design. So that is the contractor scope. Where in the contract says so? So first of all, the scope is the defined term. It's defined under clause 11.2, bracket 16. So that's a definition. Then we read on. What is the implication or the significance of the scope? Well, it defines the contractor's responsibility. Under clause 20.1, the contractor is to provide the works in accordance with the scope. So up to that moment, everything is fine. Everything is fine. So we know the contractor is to provide the works in accordance with the scope. It doesn't mention the scope has got two parts or the scope has got a client scope or contractor scope. So that's clause 20.1. Then we read on and on and on and on. Now normally during the training course, I will show the contract, like reading the contract together with you. Now, just imagine you have a contract in front of you or you get a contract yourself. You read from clause 20.1, you read on and on and on and on until clause 60.1 on compensation event. 60.1 is a clause which is a checklist. Whatever on that checklist is a compensation event. Whatever not on that checklist is not a compensation event. As simple as that. So let's look at clause 60.1. Bracket 1, focus on the second bullet point and the second sub-bullet point. Perhaps I should edit a little bit of this video and put that clause on the screen here. So, it says the project manager gives an instruction changing the scope, and this is a compensation event, except what? Except the second sub-bullet point. The second bullet point here, it says a change to the scope provided by the contractor for its design. So certainly a scope has got a certain part called the scope provided by the contractor for its design. Let me read on. Which is made at the contractor's request or in order to comply with the scope provided by the client. So we have a scope provided by the contractor for its design and a scope provided by the client. And here it says the scope provided by the contractor for its design has to comply with the scope provided by the client. It is at this moment, this clause basically indicates there is a hierarchy between two different parts of the scope. Let's call it the contractor scope and the client scope. The contractor scope has to comply with the client scope. And if there is any change to the contractor scope for its design, in order to comply with the client scope, that is not a compensation event. Now, it is at this moment we understand, oh, there are two parts in the scope now. One is the contractors, one is the client. Now, if we go back to clause 20.1 and read that again, then what does that mean? In clause 20.1, let me read that slowly. It says, the contractor provides the works in accordance with the scope. Then if we think about this, what does it mean? What do you mean by the scope here? Now, the scope here, it encapsulates basically two parts now. So the first part will be the scope provided by the contractor for its design, and it must be for its design. And second part here is the scope provided by the client. The contractor provides the works in accordance with the scope, which has two parts here. So that is the meaning of the scope in NEC 4 ECC. Why is it important? Why? Because if we look at the scope, first of all, we understand the contractor's responsibility. And secondly, it is one of the exceptions whereby a compensation event due to the change to the scope is not a compensation event. So that exception is when the contractor's scope is changed in order to comply with the client's scope. So that is the significance in here. So once again, a scope has got two parts, contractor scope and client scope. And by the way, let me add a little bit clarification here. This scope provided by the contractor for its design is identified in contract data part 2, which means this so-called contractor scope or the scope provided by the contractor for its design, I simplify it as a contractor scope, has to be submitted in the tender stage. In order for that contractor to identify that in the contract data part 2, it's not something to be submitted after the contract date, it's before the contract date, during the tender submission stage. So that is the contractor scope and the client scope. If you still have got some questions or any question regarding to these fundamental concepts, feel free to ask me. Some of you have got my WhatsApp, some of you have got my LinkedIn account. I'm more than happy to explain things for you because these are the fundamental concepts. Just as we need to take care of the health of our body and we need to understand some of the basic knowledge of our own human body, we need to have some basic understanding for the contract. Leave the details and the complex issues to the experts, but we need to understand some of the basic elements for the contract in order for us to deliver the project on time, safe, and in high quality. I hope that helps. See you again.